Good morning, welcome back. Now, perhaps some of you may have noticed that I am not in the classroom today, and you would be absolutely right. And the reason I'm not in the classroom today is not because of some grand strategy idea. It basically has to do with the fact that when I went into the classroom on Sunday, I failed to bring the stand and the microphones with me. And so the idea was I could simply have somebody hold the video, hold the camera, but then it would be this whole shaky thing. So I said, well, you know what? I can always go back to my table in the basement and talk about 1 Corinthians from there. And so here we are. It is October 8th, and so several things happened on this date that were of interest to me, which is really the my main criterion when I look at these things. It's like, is it of interest to me? It was on this date in 451 A.D. that the Council of Chalcedon convened. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 A.D. This was the fourth ecumenical church council, and it was out of this particular church council that the hypostatic union was what's the word I'm looking for? Not created, but explained or accepted. And the hypostatic union is the idea that Jesus was both 100% man and 100% God at the same time. It's an explanation. It's a description. It's not necessarily an explanation. It doesn't explain how that happened, and I don't know, but it is. There had been various controversies up until that time where people would say that, well, he was actually 100% man, couldn't have been God, and because a God couldn't die. And then it said, well, he was actually a God, he wasn't really a man. And so there were arguments back and forth there. And so it was kind of settled, at least in the mind of the Western Church, in 451 on this date. In 1664, Baptist preacher Benjamin Keach was tried for publishing a children's book, tried and found guilty of publishing a children's book that was seditious. The name of the book was called The Child's Instructor, and his crime was that it was too Baptistic, that it did not follow the accepted doctrines of the church at the time, which would have included infant baptism. He was found guilty and sentenced to 2 weeks in prison, a 20-pound fine, and 2 days in pillory. And pillory is kind of like the stocks, what we think of when we think of the stocks, with the people sitting down with their feet in their legs. But the pillory is where you're standing up and your head is through there and your hands are through. So, and then people could walk by and throw things at you and make fun of you. And so nowadays when they talk about somebody being pilloried, they're mainly referring, it kind of harkens back to that particular concept, but it's somebody being ridiculed and laughed at, and they're kind of defenseless. Of course, it was in 1871 on this date that the Great Chicago Fire started. The Great Chicago Fire went on to destroy 4 square miles, killed 300 people. And I only just found this out, apparently, and I haven't verified it, I just have one source that says that the original copy of the Emancipation Proclamation was in Chicago and was burned and destroyed as a result of the Great Chicago Fire. I did not know that, so that's something I just found out. Also in 1871, ex-con Jerry McCauley opened the Water Street Mission in New York City. This was supposedly, and I haven't verified this, but according to the one source, it was the first rescue mission created to feed the poor. It's still around, it's still in existence, but although now it's called the New York City Rescue Mission. So the Pacific Garden Mission started in Chicago, started a few years later. But Jerry McCauley was the first one. He's an ex-con, had been in prison, accepted the Lord while he was in prison, and then came out and started that. Three interesting comedy teams have historical firsts on this date. First of all, it was on this date in 1927 that Laurel and Hardy's first film was released. It was called The Second 100 Years. It was on this date in 1942 that Abbott and Costello's first radio show premiered. And it was on this date in 1944 that the Ozzie and Harriet radio show first premiered. So three great comic duos all had premieres on this date. Of course, it's October, which means there's a lot of baseball news, baseball first. So I'm not going to mention all of them, except to say that it was on this date in 1956 that Don Larson pitched the only perfect game in World Series history. Baseball's been around for 150 years now. All kinds of records, all kinds of statistics. It's kind of unusual to see something that's only been done once, and that's it. So in 1956, Don Larson pitched the only perfect game. Also in baseball, it was on this date in 1957 that the Brooklyn Dodgers announced that they were moving to L.A. And a year later, in 1958, the San Francisco Giants, the New York Giants, I should say, announced that they would move to San Francisco that year. And so for a couple of years, so for many years, New York had three professional Major League Baseball teams. And then it would go 3-4 years with the Yankees being the only baseball team in town. And it wasn't until 1962 that there was a great expansion that year. They added 7 teams to the National League. And so it was that year that the New York Mets came in. My nemesis, the New York Mets, came in 1962. So that's it for what happened on this date in history. I know when I've done this in the past, it was 2 separate videos, but I figured I would just do it all as one. So, okay, let me get back into talking about 1 Corinthians, Paul's letter to the church at Corinth. And again, I know it's been a couple of weeks, so just kind of to reiterate, Paul had visited Corinth. It's all in Acts chapter 18. He had spent a year and a half there. And after he had left there, he went to Ephesus. Now, again, so Corinth, Ephesus. And he goes to Ephesus. Now, as it happened, there was a guy in Ephesus, in the area of Ephesus, named Apollos, and this is all in Acts chapter 18, who went to Corinth after Paul. Okay, so Paul goes to Ephesus. Apollos is the guy's name. He goes from Ephesus and follows Paul in Corinth. And some of the things we know about Apollos is that he was very eloquent. He dealt with the Jews. Remember in Corinth, Paul had been dealing with the Jews and then finally just refused to talk to them at all and went next door to a Gentile's house and stayed there for the remainder of the time that he was or ministered there. As we understand it from the text, he ministered there for the remainder of his time. Apollos was able to eloquently deal with the Jews in Corinth. He met up with Priscilla and Aquila there, Paul's tent-making friends, and Priscilla and Aquila kind of corrected some of his doctrinal ideas, and we don't exactly know what his doctrinal ideas were. We know, and all we know about Apollos is these kind of mentions here. However, we do know that when Paul gets to Ephesus, and this is in Acts 19 and 20, that when Paul gets to Ephesus, he meets believers who are, and they only know the baptism of John. And so these are people that would have been disciples. This is several years, 20 years after the death of Christ, that Paul is in Ephesus there, and he meets these believers. And so it's conceivable, and again, this is speculating. I mean, I think it fits the facts, but that Apollos was part of this group in Ephesus, and so he'd gone to Corinth, and he was kind of straightened out, or given the rest of the story, I think is a better way to put it, by Aquila and Priscilla. But we also know that Apollos was eloquent. He was very eloquent, and I say all that, I point all that out to say, I've been thinking about this because, again, I'm listening to one of the ways I keep this in mind is I listen to the text. I listen to 1 Corinthians on an MP3 player, basically while I'm sleeping or going to sleep or waking up in the middle of the night. I have, and I kind of listen to each of these different chapters. And sometimes if I, how when you're awake in the middle of the night and you can't go back to sleep, I've got somebody reading First Corinthians to me, and it makes for an interesting way to really think about the text. Again, you're just straight listening to the text. There's no commentary. The reader is just reading the NIV text that I have, and you can get these with just about any version, I guess. But Paul makes several references in Corinthians to his poor speaking ability, and some persons have looked at that and said, and we know from other texts that Paul wrote that he had what he called a thorn in the flesh, and some have suggested that Paul had a speech impediment, and that was why he's referring to these particular his poor speaking abilities. And I don't, the more I think about it, and I'm just speculating here, but I think it's just, it kind of fits the concept of what's going on here. I think what's happening is Paul is not that eloquent a speaker. I think that's pretty much the bottom line here. I don't think Paul as a speaker was that what we would consider a great pulpiteer. Okay, but Apollos was, and so he's got this situation where in Corinthians, in this particular letter, we see he was in Corinthians, or he was in Corinth. He was there for a year and a half, established the church there. He leaves. Apollos comes in. Okay, Apollos is a more accomplished speaker, but apparently Apollos, or either Apollos or the Corinthian believers, were far more enmeshed in the Corinthian/Gentile approach to eternal things than Paul was. Okay, so they had far more of the Gentile mindset than Paul was. Now, whether that was a result of Apollos or not, we don't know. Just again, we just don't know. However, what we do know is, again, Paul now, and Apollos is gone. I mean, 1 Corinthians 16 clearly suggests that both Apollos and Paul are gone from Corinth at this time. So who's in charge of Corinth, we don't know. And so, I've been speculating that Paul is in this letter needs to accomplish some things. He's heard about how the church has gone off the rails. He's heard these things about that, and he needs to kind of bring the church back. That there's these conflicts between himself, or there's this separation between the church at Corinth and Paul. That the church leaders there have said, listen, Paul really wasn't dealing us straight, and we need to go back in this direction as opposed to the direction Paul was going in, and the direction that they need to. And so Paul needs to reach back and regain influence. Okay, and this is a tricky thing because he's been gone, and so it's kind of like if you can imagine a scenario where there's a pastor who is in a church for quite some time, and then the pastor leaves. And then another pastor comes in, and that other pastor has success or not or whatever, and then there's a period of time that happens, and then the original pastor, let's just say he's the original pastor hears that the church is having some issues, and the original pastor needs to, from a distance, regain influence. In how would he do that, especially if the second pastor, say, was a better speaker than him or than he had been? How do you regain influence? And I think that's kind of this challenge that Paul is facing. And so as he's writing to the church at Corinth, he's conscious that the readers at Corinth are always comparing him to Apollos. And I think the question about Cephas, what is it? Apollos, Cephas, Peter, Apollos, Cephas, I'm of Paul, I'm of Cephas, I'm of Apollos, I'm of Jesus. I think the two main groups are Apollos and Paul. I think, and he's constantly saying, "Listen, I know I'm not as good a speaker as Apollos," and I think all of these references in Corinthians may be simply that. He's just trying to say, "Look, I understand. Don't let Apollos' eloquence make you ignore me. And so that's important. That's an important introduction as we get into 1 Corinthians 1 and 2 to kind of say, okay, what is Paul trying to argue? And the direction that the Corinthians are going, the argument is that the direction that the Corinthian church is going is this pursuit of wisdom. This pursuit of earthly wisdom, Sophia is the Greek word, that they're in pursuit of this wisdom. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:18 that he didn't come with great words, eloquence, or great wisdom kind of thing. And again, so today as we look through 1 Corinthians, beginning with verse 18, we'll see that, he keeps talking about this idea of wisdom. So, I shouldn't say it wasn't in 17, it was in verse 17, chapter 1 verse 17, where Paul says, again, after this question about baptism and the groups, he says, Christ didn't send me to baptize. He sent me to preach the gospel, not with wisdom. Again, that's that Sophia, that wisdom that the Gentile Christians there in Corinthians so prized, but with, or eloquence. I didn't come with wisdom and eloquence. I didn't come with this worldly wisdom that you so desire, nor did I come with the eloquence that, and I suppose, that Apollos had. Okay? Lest the cross of Christ be emptied of his power. So now he's going to start talking, beginning with verse 18. Paul is going to make an extended comparison of wisdom versus foolishness. Okay? So he starts off in verse 18 where he's talking about the wisdom of the world and the cross of Christ. So in verse 18 he says, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing." And those who are perishing are those who are just simply non-believers. Okay? Now, are they in the act of dying? Are they clutching them and it's the big one? No, that's not it. It's just that these are the ones that are destined to die. Okay? The non-believers. It's foolishness. And it is foolishness. Like it is a kind of a hard to believe idea. It's like, okay, wait a minute. Our eternal destiny is tied up in this act of a person dying who was a guy, but he was God. This hypostatic union. How could he be both God and man? Kind of thing. That matters. So it is, at a certain level, it is a fairly foolish, hard to believe position. Okay? He says, but to those of us who are being saved, those of us who are being drawn out of that group of perishing, the ones who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, and this is in Isaiah 29, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligent of the intelligent I will frustrate. Now here Isaiah is talking about in the Old Testament, and Paul is saying this was always God's plan. It was always God's plan or God's plan would always seem like foolishness to the earth, to those who are perishing, to those on earth. And so Paul kind of gives a direct attack here, beginning with verse 20. He says, where is the wise person? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the philosopher of this age? Okay, it's like, who you got? Who's your guy here? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Okay, has not... And Paul uses this idea, this construction, where he just kind of asks a rhetorical question. It's, and maybe they're not buying it. Maybe they don't understand. This is kind of a way, don't you realize what God has done here? He's made foolish the wisdom of this world. For since the wisdom of God, verse 21, for since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him. This is kind of an interesting thing. In its wisdom did not know him, because, the wisdom of the world starts without an acknowledgement of God's existence. And I think that's when you look at modern analytical approaches to life, or theories of how things work and things like that. If you eliminate the idea that there's a supernatural element to it, that there's something beyond what you can see, well, then you're going to draw these conclusions. Remember when we talked about Ecclesiastes? And one of the things about Ecclesiastes is that is a picture of the world that does not acknowledge a supernatural being, that does not acknowledge a God that can have an impact on the world. Okay? And so in its wisdom, which doesn't include God, would acknowledge God. Well, of course it's not going to acknowledge God. It's not going to recognize God because it doesn't acknowledge God. Okay. For since in the wisdom, verse 21, for since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. Now, this foolishness is certainly from the world's perspective here. But God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached. It's just interesting that this was always God's plan. And this is kind of, perhaps, the idea here to me is that God is somehow amused by this, that oh, seriously, look at these guys down there trying to figure that out. It's kind of like, the adult watching the child struggle with something that is clearly an easy task. It hasn't clicked with them. Whether it's putting square shapes and square holes or anything like that, it's just watching them just struggle with this particular, and doing it completely wrong, and you're sitting back thinking to yourself, okay, do I step in, or do I just let them figure it out? Okay. But God was pleased to do this. And in verse 22, Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom. Okay, and I think where it talks about that, Jews demand signs. If you remember back in any of the gospel accounts in Matthew chapter 12, the Jews and the teachers of the law were always saying, give us a sign, give us a sign, give us a sign. Okay, it kind of proved to us by some sign that you are who you say you are. Okay, and sometimes Jesus obliged, sometimes he didn't. Okay, and he says Greeks demand and Greeks look for wisdom, and that's what the Corinthians are for the most part. I mean, there's a Jewish population there, but the Corinthians are a Greek/Gentile group, and they're looking for this wisdom, this reasoning things out. And here Paul is saying, no, there's just some elements that you just have to believe, you just have to understand. In Hebrews 11 it says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not believed. Not seen. Okay, so it's Paul's saying you just have to suddenly believe here. Jews demand signs, so the Jews on the one hand demand signs, and the Greeks demand wisdom. But we, and this is Paul, I think Paul is speaking, collectively for the apostles or those who are preaching the gospel. But we preach Christ crucified. Okay, our story, our point is neither. We don't satisfy the Jews or the Greeks. Okay, but to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. Okay, so here he's talking to the Gentiles, and he's saying, listen, this desire for wisdom on your part, okay, this desire for your part is not, we're not going to meet that. And I'm not going to meet that, and Apollos isn't going to meet that. And even if we could, it's not going to get what we really want. It's not going to reach salvation, or it's not going to provide a salvation for you. Okay, so even if you could achieve some sort of wisdom at that level, it's not going to accomplish what you think it's going to accomplish. Verse 26, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. Okay, so Paul's like, okay, think about what you guys are. I mean, did you really deserve to be called into God's kingdom? Okay, but God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. God chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are. Why does God choose these outcasts? I mean, we talked about Luke. We talked about Jesus going to the outcasts. Why did God choose all of these? That's not who you'd think it would be. It wasn't who you thought it would be. It wasn't who you thought it'd be. And this is a picture that goes all the way back to the Old Testament. I mean, remember when David was chosen as king? Okay, Saul was chosen as king, and Saul was chosen as king because he looked like a king. He was like a foot taller than everyone else. Okay, he stood out in the crowd and go, oh yeah, that's our king. And how did Saul turn out? Yet David is the youngest of a large family. He was not the one anybody would have chosen. He wasn't even in the lineup when Samuel comes to David's household to look for a king. Jesse, his dad, says, "Oh yeah, I got sons. Come on, here, come on," and he lines them all up. And Samuel goes down the line and goes, "Well, it's not. Sure, are you sure this is it? God told me you had a son here." And Jesse's like, "Well, I do have another son. It wasn't who we thought." And so God has been working this way that we think, okay, that is clearly somebody God would choose. And perhaps we think about that on our own. We think, oh, God is sure lucky to have me. Okay, no, he's not. Okay, but why does he do this? Verse 29, so that no one may boast before him. Okay, we're not where we are. We don't have salvation. We don't have this relationship with God because of anything we've done. Okay, it's not that God isn't lucky to have us. I guess it really is the way to look at it. It is because of him that you are in Christ Jesus, who has become for us wisdom from God. That is our righteousness, holiness, and redemption. Therefore, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. Listen, if you're going to brag about anything, brag about the fact that the Lord saw fit to choose you. Okay? That the Lord saw fit to provide the salvation, that if you accept Christ, that you are now one of the children of God, as John chapter 1 points out. Okay. And so it is with me. I'm in chapter 2, verse 1. And so it is with me, brothers and sisters. When I came to you, I did not come with eloquence or human wisdom. Okay, this is the second time he's made this point. Okay, again, I'm not as flashy a speaker as Apollos, and I wasn't choosing the wisdom that you guys, that the Gentiles in your area are so enamored with. As I proclaim to you the testimony about God, for I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Again, going back to that idea that it's not going to please the Jews. It's not going to please Paul knows from experience that his message isn't going to please the Jews. By this point, he's figured out that the Jewish nation is not going to simply roll over and agree that Christianity is simply the next development in Judaism. And he knows now that the Gentiles' search for wisdom is taking the church on the wrong direction that way. Okay, I came to you in weakness with great fear and trembling. My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words. So here again, Paul is talking about his speaking ability. Okay, now some have looked at this again and said, this is just proof of a speech impediment. Or some have looked at this to say, well, okay, this is not, Paul is just pointing out that it's all about God. And it is, ultimately it's all about God. And he's saying that based on what the Greeks want, my speaking was not eligible. And certainly I don't think compared to Apollos, I was that persuasive. Okay. But my message were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom, but on God's power. Now here Paul introduces an idea that what I did come with, I came with something that the Greeks don't have and the Jews don't have. I came with the Spirit's power. Okay, and he's going to bring back the Spirit here, talking about the Holy Spirit in a few minutes. Now in verse 6, chapter 2, verse 6, Paul kind of turns the argument around. He's been saying, listen, this wisdom you want is foolishness to God. Don't just be don't be seeking wisdom. Don't be spending your time working on that wisdom. You guys have gone off the wrong track. You're on this path that is not leading you toward righteousness, okay, or closer to righteousness. He says, and so he's been downplaying or denigrating this idea of wisdom, but yet here in verse 6, we do, however, speak a message of wisdom among the mature, but not the wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age who are coming to nothing. Again, he's going to have a couple of other things about the rulers of this age. Okay. It says, no, we declare God's wisdom. There is a wisdom from God. It's not the wisdom you're looking at, but there is a wisdom from God. A mystery that has been hidden and that God destined for our glory before time began. Okay. Again, a mystery in the New Testament is simply something that was hidden, but is now revealed. It's not like I'm going to give you a riddle and you're going to have to figure it out. Okay, it was hidden. It was hidden so well. It says none of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. Okay, if anybody really understood what was going on, then this would have never happened. And the apostles didn't understand what was going on either. Okay, and if you read the book of Acts, you realize it isn't until Pentecost, or excuse me, somewhere between the resurrection. Certainly, the resurrection clued them in the 40 days that Jesus was on earth, and then the Spirit's coming at Pentecost, where Peter stands up in Acts chapter 2 and preaches and says, "This is all part of Scripture." And in Luke 24, you have Jesus with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, where he lays it out and says, "This is how it was supposed to work. This is how it all comes together." Okay, and the two disciples on the road to Emmaus go back to the disciples and say, "Here's how it was supposed to work. Here's how it all fits together." Okay. However, as it is written, what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard, what no human mind has ever conceived, the things God has prepared for those who love him. Okay, so again, this is another quotation from Isaiah 64, and he's pointing out that, okay, this mystery, you would have never figured this out on your own. You would have never gotten this on your own. These are the things God has revealed to us by the Spirit. How do we know this mystery? How do we have God's wisdom? It's through the Spirit. And what does the Spirit do for us? We find out in verse 10, at the end of verse 10. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who knows a person's thought except their own spirit within them? Now, Paul is going to develop an argument here on why it's important to have the Spirit, and I'm going to skip forward kind of a doctrinal idea, this indwelling idea of the Holy Spirit within us. Okay, and it's the idea of like is recognized by like, or in a more colloquial way to put it, it takes one to know one. That's kind of the point that Paul is making here. Okay, and he says, so for who knows a person's thought except their own spirit within them? Okay, have you ever been at a meeting or discussion where somebody makes a statement? And this kind of annoys me when I'm at a meeting where this happens. And so person A is at a meeting, and he or she makes a statement. Statement is made, and everybody is kind of sitting there thinking, trying to kind of unwrap what he or she said in their head. And then somebody else, person B says, well, what I think person A is saying is this. And then person C says, well, what I think person C is saying is this. And then person B and C get in a discussion about what person A was really. Now, person A is still sitting there. And there's a certain type of person in meetings, and if you've been in any kind of meetings, there's a certain character that appears at meetings, and he or she doesn't really want to deal with the give and take, doesn't want to deal with the conversation. They just kind of sit back and occasionally blurt out, "Thus saith the person A," and then just stays kind of stoic after that, or quiet, I should say. Maybe not stoic, just quiet. And I've been in meetings like that, and suddenly people are discussing what person A meant. All the time person A is still sitting there. And if I ever, I got to the point when I was in one church, not my current church, there was a real tendency for this to happen, and I would stop the conversation. I'd go, listen, why don't we just go back to person A? Hey, you, tell us, okay, unwrap this. You're going to make these statements. What are you going to do? But regardless, get it from the person's mind, right? Don't talk about what he or she would have said, was thinking, if he or she is sitting right there, okay? And so Paul is just making that argument. Who best knows a person than the person themselves? Okay? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Okay? And now again, here's an idea, kind of, this is based on the kind of the unity of the Trinity, that the Spirit is God and God the Father is God, that they know each other so intimately because they're the same person. Okay? What we have received is not the spirit of the world. This is not some crazy idea we got. And it does not suggest that there is a spirit of the world somewhere floating around, other than just sort of like the conventional ideas or whatever. It says, but this is an actual Spirit of God that has been received. What we have received is not the spirit of the world, I'm in verse 12, but the Spirit who is from God, so that we may understand what God has freely given us. Okay, so we have the Spirit, and as a result of having the Spirit, we can understand the message of God, the words of God, the Word of God, because we have the Spirit. Okay, this is what we speak, not in words taught to us by human wisdom, but in words taught by the Spirit. And I think here, again, Paul is making a subtle little allusion. We the apostles, we're not trying to talk to you about using the wisdom vernacular or the wisdom vocabulary that the Gentiles like. We use concepts and words and teachings given us by the Spirit of God. Okay? Explaining realities with Spirit-taught words. Okay? This is the Spirit gave us these words. In verse 14, a very well-known passage, the person without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God, but considers them, what? Foolishness. Okay, so again, this is this is one of the King James verses that, to me, that I memorized it in the King James. The natural man receiveth not the things of the Spirit of God, because they are foolishness unto him. Neither can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. Okay, so the idea is that if you're not getting this, if you're not understanding these Spirit-taught words, perhaps you don't have the Spirit. Maybe that's why you don't understand it. Maybe that's why it doesn't make sense to you, kind of thing. There's the old joke about, the Bible. I don't know if it's a joke or what it is, but, the Bible is God's love letter to man. And I'm not saying how accurate that is. And if you don't understand it, it's because you're reading someone else's mail or, to his people, because the Bible is God's love letter to man. And if you don't understand it, or to believers, and if you don't understand it, it's because you're reading someone else's mail. Something along that line. I'll have to look it up. It's an old joke. But so the person without the Spirit can't understand these things. But the person with the Spirit, verse 15, makes judgments about all things, but such a person is not subject to merely human judgments. Now, first of all, side note here, okay, this verse is not a license to judge, which says the person with the Spirit makes judgments about all things. I think it's just having the Spirit allows you to be critical about what you're hearing. When you hear a sermon, when you hear a statement, when you hear an explanation, something inside you goes, that's just not quite right. Something, and a lot of times for me, it isn't that I can automatically say, oh, that's wrong. I'm very quick to be able to point out something's not right about that, although I can't necessarily put my finger on what it is. And it may take me a while to think about it and read about it, pray about it, before I understand exactly what it is. But be that as it may, nor is it it's not immunity from criticism. Okay, it says, but such a person is not subject to merely human judgments. Okay, so it's like, well, I have the Spirit, so you can't, God gave me this message, so you can't criticize me. Well, I don't know about that. It's like, I think many of us have all been in situations where somebody presents something to you and says, well, God called me to do this. I remember I went to a Christian high school, and when I was like a sophomore or junior, they were having class elections, and this guy gets up to give his speech, and his speech was, vote for me for student body, whatever it was, probably student body president. I remember the guy now that the more I think about it, I remember the guy, I remember the speech. And one of his arguments was that God called him to be the student body president. Okay. And that was his speech. And he didn't win the election, which I always thought was funny. I think he was running, I don't know, he was running against the pastor's son, perhaps. No, I don't think so. It wouldn't have been that year. But he didn't win. And for some reason, I've always remembered that particular example where somebody presented something as clearly, oh, this is God's will. God has called me to do this, and yet he didn't win the election. But be that as it may, you could have said to him, I don't think God is in the business of calling people to win student body elections in particular schools, but, who knows. Again, a third quotation from Isaiah, who has known the mind of the Lord so as to instruct him? Okay, so who can say anything about the mind of the Lord? Well, we can, because at the end of verse 16, we have the mind of Christ. Because we have the mind of Christ. Okay. Now this is kind of the idea again in same ideas in Philippians 2. The NIV, let this state of mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. That self-kenosis passage. But here it's like, we have the mind of Christ. Our believers, we have that spirit. Because we have that spirit, our mind is Christ's mind, kind of thing, which is possibly both reassuring and terrifying. But okay, well, that's as far as I'm going to go. We're at the end of chapter 2. Now, next week, we're going to get into chapter 3, and I'll be back in the classroom, provided I remember to bring all the equipment with me. But we'll be back in the classroom tomorrow talking about the church and its leaders, kind of what do we do with this here beginning in chapter 3. So, again, next week, back in the classroom. Thank you very much for indulging me here back in my basement today.